There are times when you believe you have someone figured out, and then one quiet moment makes you question everything you thought you knew about them. Their silence can look like indifference. Their distance can feel like a clear sign that they have stopped caring. Their composed expression can make you believe nothing is happening beneath the surface, but appearances can be deeply misleading. Sometimes the person who seems the calmest is carrying the greatest amount of emotional conflict internally. The person who steps away may not actually be trying to escape you at all. They may be trying to escape the overwhelming feelings happening inside them. And when you're dealing with an avoidant person, that inner struggle usually existed long before you became part of their life. What you see is only the outside, the silence, the withdrawal, the sudden need for space. You cannot see what happens inside their body when emotions become intense. You cannot hear the thoughts racing through their mind when intimacy begins feeling too powerful, or when another person gets emotionally close. From the outside, it can simply look like they have become distant without explanation, but internally, their nervous system may be reacting as though something dangerous is happening. There can be a deep desire for connection existing alongside an equally powerful fear of losing independence. Somewhere along the way, they may have learned that love comes with pressure, emotional demands, or expectations, and that closeness can eventually cost them their sense of freedom. So when a relationship begins becoming more meaningful, old protective patterns can appear automatically. They may not consciously decide to create distance. Their mind and body may simply recognize closeness as something they need to protect themselves from. This is why their withdrawal can feel so confusing when you do not understand what is happening underneath it. You may wonder why they suddenly become distant at the exact moment when the relationship starts feeling stronger. You may assume you did something wrong, that their feelings disappeared, or that they were never emotionally invested in the first place. But sometimes they are not actually moving away from you. They are moving away from an internal emotional state that feels unfamiliar, overwhelming, or unsafe. Once you understand this, many of their confusing behaviors begin to look different. Avoidance is often discussed through simple assumptions. They do not care, they are emotionally unavailable, they are playing games, or they have lost interest. But human behavior is rarely that simple. Beneath the withdrawal can be a complicated emotional history, learned defenses, and a nervous system that developed its own way of surviving uncomfortable levels of intimacy. An avoidant person is not necessarily cold. They may simply be highly protected. They are not automatically without feelings. In many cases, they are extremely cautious about allowing those feelings to become visible. And one of the biggest misunderstandings is believing that they withdraw because they feel nothing. Sometimes the opposite is closer to the truth. They can pull away because what they are feeling has become difficult for them to process while maintaining their sense of control. Once you understand how these emotional defenses were developed, certain behaviors begin to make much more sense. You begin to recognize why a particular conversation, emotional tone, or approach can make them close down, while a calm and spacious approach can make them feel safe enough to remain present. Their emotional defenses did not suddenly appear when they entered adulthood. They were often shaped much earlier through repeated experiences that taught them how to relate to vulnerability, dependence, emotional expression, and closeness. For some people, those lessons came from an environment that looked perfectly normal from the outside. There may not have been obvious trauma or dramatic conflict. Perhaps the adults in their life were physically present but emotionally inconsistent. Maybe affection existed sometimes but disappeared at other times. Maybe emotional needs were ignored, minimized, or treated as inconvenient. A child can absorb small messages without anyone intentionally teaching them. They may hear things like, "Be strong," "Stop crying," "You need to handle this yourself," or "Don't be so sensitive." Over time, those messages can shape the way the child understands emotions. They may begin believing that showing vulnerability creates discomfort instead of connection. They may learn that needing someone makes them weak, while handling everything independently makes them safe. So instead of reaching outward when they are hurt, they learn to turn inward. Instead of asking for comfort, they learn to manage themselves. Eventually, emotional independence becomes less of a preference and more of a survival skill. As that child becomes an adult, those early lessons can become deeply automatic. Independence starts feeling safer than dependence. Controlling their emotions feels more comfortable than exposing them. They may become extremely capable of handling problems alone because they have spent years believing that relying on someone else creates risk. This does not mean they do not want intimacy. In fact, many avoidant people genuinely crave a meaningful bond. The conflict appears when that bond becomes emotionally intense enough to challenge their protective system. When another person starts getting very close, old alarms can activate without conscious intention. What looks like rejection from the outside may actually be an attempt to reduce internal overwhelm. What looks like a lack of care may sometimes be fear of becoming emotionally responsible for another person's feelings. Their mind may interpret closeness as something that could eventually demand too much from them, leaving them without enough emotional space of their own. That is why their withdrawal can feel so personal, even when the pattern began long before you ever met them. They may not be escaping you as an individual. They may be escaping emotional experiences they never learned to handle comfortably. They may be protecting themselves from becoming the person who feels pressured, controlled, emotionally responsible, or unable to breathe inside a relationship. Somewhere in their history, closeness may have become connected with expectations, disappointment, conflict, or the feeling that there was no room for their own needs. So when intimacy begins activating those old associations, distance becomes their instinctive answer. This protective response was created before you entered their life, which means you did not necessarily create the wound simply by getting close. Psychology often describes these patterns through the idea of deactivating strategies. These are automatic ways of reducing emotional intimacy when closeness begins feeling overwhelming. An avoidant person might suddenly need space after sharing something deeply personal. They may become highly logical when emotions start becoming intense. They may tell themselves that they should step back, that the other person is better without them, or that they do not really need the relationship anyway. These thoughts can feel very convincing in the moment, but they may be serving a protective purpose rather than reflecting the full reality of what they feel. Their mind is trying to reduce emotional intensity so they can return to a state that feels manageable. The sudden shift from warmth to distance can therefore be less about destroying the relationship and more about restoring a sense of internal control. Their nervous system learned this response through earlier experiences, and it can activate automatically before they even understand why they suddenly want space. That is why chasing them with more emotional intensity can sometimes make the withdrawal stronger. If their system already feels overwhelmed, additional pressure may register as confirmation that they need even more distance. What they need is not necessarily someone who loves them harder in the moment. They may need enough emotional safety and breathing room to remain connected without feeling as though closeness means losing themselves. And this is where the deepest contradiction appears. Avoidant people can genuinely want intimacy while simultaneously becoming uncomfortable when intimacy gets too close. They may want someone who understands them, supports them, and makes them feel emotionally connected, but they may struggle when that connection starts feeling consuming. They want love without feeling swallowed by it. They want support without feeling dependent. They want closeness while still being able to maintain their identity, freedom, routines, and emotional space. That creates a constant internal push and pull. One moment they may move toward you because they feel safe and connected, and another moment they may retreat because the same closeness has started activating fear. It can look inconsistent, but underneath it may be a conflict between two powerful needs, the need for connection and the need for protection. Their behavior becomes easier to understand when you stop viewing every movement toward or away from you as a simple statement about how much they care. Understanding this emotional pattern matters because it changes the way you respond. Once you recognize the difference between emotional withdrawal and genuine rejection, you become less likely to take every period of silence personally. You stop automatically assuming that their need for space means you are not enough. You stop responding to their distance with panic, pressure, or emotional demands. Instead, you become more aware of what might be happening inside the dynamic itself. That does not mean accepting unhealthy behavior or endlessly waiting for someone to change. It means understanding that emotional pressure can sometimes activate the very defense you are trying to overcome. When an avoidant person already feels overwhelmed, intense conversations, Repeated demands for reassurance, accusations, or emotional urgency can make their nervous system move even further into protection. The more pressure they feel, the more strongly they may believe that retreating is the only way to regain emotional balance. What tends to create a different experience is calmness, clarity, and emotional room. An avoidant person is more likely to stay emotionally present when connection does not feel like a demand for immediate access to every thought and feeling. Spaciousness does not mean becoming cold or playing games. It means allowing the relationship to breathe while still maintaining honesty and self-respect. Calm communication can lower the sense of threat that emotional intensity sometimes creates. Clear expectations can feel safer than unpredictable emotional reactions. And when someone can experience closeness without feeling that their independence is disappearing, their defenses may not need to work as hard. This is why understanding their emotional design can change the entire dynamic. You stop trying to force open a door that is protected by fear, and you begin creating conditions where the person behind that door can decide whether it is safe enough to open it themselves. The most effective way to communicate with an avoidant is through language that creates an invitation rather than making them feel obligated to respond. Your words can offer reassurance without surrounding them, and they can communicate confidence without creating pressure. When they recognize that you are emotionally grounded instead of reacting impulsively to their distance, something inside them can begin to settle. When your presence does not carry guilt, urgency, or the expectation that they must immediately give you something emotionally, their nervous system has more room to relax. And once they feel calmer, they are more capable of actually listening, trusting, and expressing themselves. Avoidant people can develop deep and consistent emotional openness, but it usually happens when they are not being rushed into closeness. They open more naturally when their boundaries are respected, and their need for space is not automatically treated as rejection. That is why trying to find the perfect words or waiting for the perfect opportunity is not the most important thing. Before you focus on what to say to an avoidant person, you have to understand what their withdrawal is actually protecting. Their avoidance is not necessarily your enemy. It is an old protective strategy that may have helped them feel emotionally secure long before you became part of their life. Once you can see the person underneath the distance, your approach naturally changes. You stop trying to force emotional access and start offering a steady presence. You stop pushing for immediate vulnerability and allow trust to develop naturally. Because you cannot truly reach an avoidant by ignoring what they are protecting. Often, they are not primarily protecting themselves from another person. They are protecting themselves from the fear that becoming deeply connected will cause them to lose who they are. And when an avoidant begins realizing that your presence does not threaten their identity, something important can shift. They begin to understand that you are not trying to control them, absorb them, or take away their independence. You are simply trying to know them without demanding that they become someone else. That distinction can make emotional closeness feel much safer. The connection then has an opportunity to grow from trust instead of fear. If you genuinely want to understand how to communicate with an avoidant, you have to recognize what actually carries value in their emotional world. It is not dramatic affection or overwhelming displays of love. It is not long emotional speeches or constant attempts to prove how deeply you care. What matters more is emotional safety. They need to experience a relationship where closeness does not feel invasive, where affection does not become pressure, and where intimacy is allowed to develop without being forced into existence. This is where many people misunderstand the avoidant pattern. They assume that stronger connection requires more emotional expression, deeper conversations, constant reassurance, and repeatedly discussing every feeling. Those things can be healthy in the right relationship, but when someone already experiences emotional intensity as overwhelming, increasing the pressure can produce the opposite result. The more they feel pushed toward an emotional response, the more likely they may be to retreat. This does not automatically mean they do not care. Their nervous system may simply interpret emotional pressure as a signal that they are losing control of their personal space. Even when your intention is completely loving, their internal response can still be defensive. This is why emotional safety becomes so important. They need to feel that they can remain connected to you without having to surrender their individuality, explain every emotion immediately, or constantly prove the depth of their feelings. At the center of this is one powerful need, the ability to remain themselves while being close to someone else. Think about what that means. Their greatest struggle may not be intimacy itself. It may be what they believe intimacy could eventually cost them. They may fear losing their independence, their freedom, their routines, their emotional boundaries, or the private inner world that gives them a sense of stability. When closeness begins feeling like a threat to those things, their protective system can activate. They might suddenly become quieter, create more physical or emotional distance, or stop engaging altogether. From your perspective, it can look as though they are deliberately rejecting you. But internally, they may simply be trying to create enough space to feel like themselves again. The distance is not always about wanting less of you. Sometimes it is about needing less emotional pressure surrounding the connection. This is exactly where people can unintentionally make the situation worse. When an avoidant withdraws, the natural reaction may be to pursue harder. You may ask more questions, seek immediate explanations, initiate heavier conversations, or repeatedly try to resolve the situation. You may believe that more communication will automatically create more closeness. But what feels like an attempt to repair the relationship from your perspective can feel like increasing pressure from theirs. The emotional space becomes smaller instead of larger. You move toward them because you want reassurance, and they move farther away because they need relief. You ask for more connection, and they respond with less availability. You want answers immediately, while they want enough breathing room to understand what they are feeling. Then the pattern reinforces itself. The more distance you experience, the more you pursue. The more you pursue, the more overwhelmed they become. And the more overwhelmed they become, the more they retreat. This does not mean an avoidant person has no emotions or cannot experience love deeply. In many cases, their emotional world can be much richer than their outward behavior suggests. The difference is that they may not process emotional intensity through immediate expression or constant communication. Their internal system can require more time and space to make sense of what they feel. Something that you might want to discuss immediately may be something they need to process privately before they can even identify what is happening inside them. That is why your choice of language can have a much greater impact than you realize. With an avoidant, communication is not only about the words themselves, they are also paying attention to what those words imply. They may be listening for signs that they are about to be trapped, judged, pressured, emotionally controlled, or expected to respond before they are ready. They can be highly sensitive to the emotional meaning behind a conversation. A simple question can feel very different depending on the energy surrounding it. A statement that leaves room for choice may feel safe, while the same message delivered with urgency can feel threatening. They may notice whether you are trying to understand them or extract something from them. They may notice whether your reassurance comes with hidden expectations. They may notice whether your concern gives them space or makes them responsible for immediately calming your anxiety. In other words, they are often looking for evidence that connection does not equal control. When they sense emotional freedom alongside emotional consistency, their defenses have less reason to activate. And when those defenses begin settling, genuine communication becomes much easier because they no longer feel like every emotional conversation is a test they have to pass. The words that tend to reach an avoidant person most effectively are the ones that lower emotional pressure, protect their sense of independence, and allow them to engage at a pace that feels manageable. What they often need is not less connection, but less urgency surrounding that connection. This does not mean you have to become overly careful with every word or behave as though they might break. It means understanding how their nervous system can interpret emotionally intense situations. You are not trying to argue with their defenses or overpower them. You are communicating in a way that allows those defenses to relax naturally. That requires a calm tone, clear intentions, emotional steadiness, and an energy that does not chase or demand immediate closeness. When an avoidant experiences that kind of emotional space, they may stop anticipating the next emotional wave. They begin to feel less guarded, and their body can finally settle enough for genuine connection to become possible. Avoidant people are not incapable of emotional connection. They often struggle most when connection arrives, wrapped in pressure, urgency, or the expectation that they must immediately respond in a certain way. When that pressure decreases, another side of them has room to emerge. This is why it can sometimes seem like the less you push, the more naturally they move closer. The less you demand, the more freely they may offer. The less you chase for reassurance, the more opportunity they have to choose connection for themselves. But emotional safety should never be confused with passive silence or pretending that you have no emotional needs. You can still communicate what matters to you. The difference is in how you communicate it. You can express your feelings without requiring an immediate emotional performance in return. You can give someone time to process without automatically assuming their quietness means rejection. You can maintain your own emotional stability so they do not feel responsible for constantly managing your reactions. When this becomes consistent, you can become a very different kind of presence in an avoidant person's life. You become someone around whom they do not constantly have to protect themselves. Being with you does not feel like walking through an emotional minefield, wondering when another intense conversation will appear or when they will be criticized for needing time. They begin to discover that they can slow down without being punished for it. They can have boundaries without those boundaries automatically becoming evidence that they do not care. They can take time to process without losing the relationship. This is where something deeper can begin changing. Avoidant people are not generally brought into emotional openness through force. They respond more naturally to emotional stability. They do not necessarily become vulnerable because someone repeatedly asks them to. They become vulnerable when the environment around them feels safe enough that vulnerability no longer seems like a threat. That kind of safety is built through countless small experiences rather than one dramatic conversation. The message behind those small experiences is simple. I am here, but I am not going to overwhelm you. You can be yourself around me. Being close to me does not require you to surrender your freedom. When someone consistently communicates those ideas through their actions and words, the avoidant person's nervous system may begin interpreting the relationship differently. Your communication stops feeling like something they need to defend themselves against. Instead, it starts becoming evidence that connection can exist without emotional invasion. And that is the shift that matters most. Deep connection is not created by forcing emotional intensity higher and higher. It develops when both people experience enough safety to remain present. For someone with strong avoidant tendencies, emotional safety can carry more weight than persuasion, dramatic affection, or repeated declarations of love. When you build that sense of safety through consistency, respect, and emotional steadiness, you create the possibility for them to meet you in ways that pressure never could. This is why the idea of 3 words having a deeper impact than I love you is not really about magic words or some secret psychological formula. It is about understanding the emotional patterns that can shape avoidant behavior. For some avoidant people, hearing I love you can be beautiful, but it can also carry an unexpected sense of responsibility. They may hear an emotional declaration and immediately wonder what is expected of them next. Does this mean I need to respond the same way? Am I supposed to become more emotionally available? Is this relationship about to become more demanding? When someone has learned to associate deep attachment with a possible loss of independence, even affection can sometimes activate their protective instincts. So the question becomes less about finding a romantic phrase and more about discovering what communicates acceptance without creating emotional obligation. The words that often resonate most are simple, grounded, and freeing. They do not pull the person closer by force. They simply communicate that the door is open. One phrase that can carry surprising emotional weight is, I get it. On the surface, those words may sound almost ordinary. They do not have the dramatic quality of a passionate declaration, and they do not seem powerful enough to change a relationship. But their meaning can be much deeper when they are expressed sincerely. I get it communicates understanding rather than demand. It tells the other person that you are trying to understand their experience instead of immediately judging their behavior. For an avoidant person, that can feel intimate in a very different way. It can communicate that they are not automatically wrong because they need space. They do not have to completely transform their personality to remain connected with you. Their boundaries do not automatically make them a bad partner. Their slower pace does not automatically make them incapable of caring. You are acknowledging that there is an inner reason behind their behavior, even if you do not agree with every choice they make. When you say, "I get it," you are also communicating that you can recognize their internal rhythm without trying to control it. You are not telling them that their fears are correct, and you are not encouraging unhealthy avoidance. You are simply showing that you can see the person beneath the behavior. That distinction matters. Avoidant people may become especially sensitive when they sense that someone is disappointed in them or expects them to behave differently immediately. If they believe they are failing emotionally, retreat can become an easy way to escape that uncomfortable feeling. But when the response is calm understanding rather than criticism or emotional escalation, the urge to defend themselves may decrease. They can remain present without feeling that every conversation is an accusation. They can process without constantly worrying that their need for space has already damaged the connection beyond repair. There can also be a quiet layer of shame underneath avoidant behavior that many people never see. An avoidant person may already know that they withdraw. They may realize that their silence confuses people. They may know that they sometimes take longer than others to trust, communicate, or become emotionally expressive. And beneath all of that, some may carry a private belief that they are simply too difficult to love. They can communicate. They can allow themselves to be known without immediately searching for an exit. In that sense, the person who once seemed to be running away from you may actually be learning how to stop running from the fears they have carried inside themselves for years. And that is when closeness becomes something they can finally experience as a choice rather than a threat.